Alright, in this lesson right here, what we're going to be doing is introducing you to the basic tools that you're going to be using for working with terrain. Just the basic terrain itself. We're also going to show you, very basic, how to go about adding sunlight into your scene. Right, Logan?
That's right, just so we have a better idea of how some of the tools are working. With a light and shadowed side of the terrain, we'll be able to see the effect in 3D more easily.
Now, starting out at this level here, one of the things we want to show you, which is really cool, is what happens if you selected a texture that you didn't mean to select when you actually created a new layer. Well, we've done that here. We've got a texture that we're using right now for layer 1 that we don't want. We don't want a snow type level here.
Right, so to go about swapping this texture out, it's very easy. Simply load up the texture package that you actually wanted to use, and I'll spend just a second longer, make sure I grab the right one. And with that in place, I'll simply select the texture I want to use for the terrain itself. With it selected, and with the layer I want to change selected, I can right-click on it and say Set Texture from Current. With that, now I've reset the texture. It's that simple.
Very nice.
Alright, now, back over on the Terrains tab, we'll start going through and trying out the various tools on this terrain. First, make sure, once you're working with terrain, make sure that the height map itself is actually selected. Some of the tools don't matter, but some do. You have to have this height map selected before some tools will apply. So with it selected, we'll start with simple vertex editing. Now with that, we have this brush where we can define what to select. And if you want to select a group of vertices based on this brush, it's as simple as left-clicking once over the terrain. And if I was to move in on that a little bit, you'll see we have a lot of grayscale colored dots. Now, the way this worked is I've just selected part of the terrain. So if I wanted to affect it, I could hold Control, then both the left and right mouse buttons, and move up and down on the mouse. And you see I can control that selection, move it up or down. Now, the way this was defined is you notice the yellow brush, how I have the inner ring and the outer ring. Basically, anything inside that brighter yellow inner ring will get affected 100%. And these settings correspond to these options up here. You have your inner radius and outer radius. So the inner radius, so anything within 256 units, will be affected 100%. As you can see how you had a kind of a flat top across the selection that I moved up. And the outer radius simply has the effect fading out. Now the strength is the overall, like anything within the inner radius where it'll be 100% is 100% because that's what the strength is set to. If we were to lower this and simply left click again, you'll notice the inner vertices are much darker gray, so they won't move nearly as much because we've lowered the strength. And now the way vertex editing works, since you predefine a selection before working with it, let me lower the radius in a little bit so I can make more selections. If you click once, that's one selection, and you can add to it by holding Control and clicking elsewhere, and the selection will grow. Let me go ahead and set my strength back up just so it's a little bit easier to see. Now, and you'll notice that if you continue to click, the selection will grow and actually fade into itself, which is kind of cool. So you have a decent amount of control and a smooth control over vertex editing using this method. Now, one last thing is you can lower, with soft selection, you notice how you have a soft selection where it fades from completely selected to almost not affected. We can turn this off, and now if I was to left click, I'll just grab single vertices, which is kind of cool because then I can turn that back on and hit select, and it'll actually fade out again based on the radius is set.
Very nice.
Radii. So with that, that's a simple vertex editing. Again, with a selection made, you can hold Control, both mouse buttons, to move the selection up or pull it in. So that would be the first method of actually going in and affecting the height map. After that, we have Select. Now, what Select will do is simply, it's used by simply holding Control and left dragging, and you specify a region to work with. Now, this is used in conjunction with the terrain generator, which is found on the miscellaneous tab. Now, this can work in two modes, either based off of a selection or over the entire height map. For starters, we'll just run off the selection we made. So I'll go ahead and with the default settings hit build, and you'll notice you've got a kind of, it took everything inside there and gave it a nice random generation or random values and smoothly generated out a little bit of terrain. It's a nice way to start if you don't want to start with a completely flat plane, if you want some 3D detail already in place. And Step simply generates how tight or how fine the areas are. If we were to double this and rebuild, you can see that that was a lot more detail in a smaller amount of space. And the strength is simply how much to affect it, how much up or down it'll move the train. If this was up to, say, 415 built, that's a much more noticeable effect. And then, of course, we could ignore the selection and use the entire height map. And let me lower some of this back down. And if I was to hit build, it'll generate terrain across the entire thing. So I hit build, and how about we lower the strength down to about 50 or 40 or 50. So this would give a starting point for terrain. I might lower that all the way down to 5. There, so you just barely have a little bit of smooth deformation over the terrain. Give you more of an organic start before you go in and customizing every little piece of the terrain.
It's very convenient.
So that's the terrain generator and how to use the select tool along with it. Now we get into actual painting. This is where we can take the brush and actually drag it across the surface to generate terrain. Now the default strength of 100 is a little bit strong for this effect, so I'm actually going to take it down to about half. And the way painting works is to pull terrain up, you hold control, and left drag across the surface. And you can see you can affect the terrain.
It's very cool.
To do the opposite, to push the terrain down, hold control and right mouse, and you can push the terrain in. Now this is very powerful because it allows you to go in and sculpt your terrain almost as if it was clay. So with that in place, we might want to go ahead at this point and set up sunlight so it gets a little bit easier to see the detail of the terrain itself. In order to do that, I'll simply deactivate terrain editing by going back into camera mode. Now, the first thing we need is an actual sunlight actor. So I'll go up to the actor class browser, go under light, and there's sunlight. I can right click on the terrain itself, add sunlight. Let me zoom in up on a little, move it up, and let me align it, actually point it down at the surface a little bit by deselecting it, grabbing the locked selected actors and clicking on it. That way I can very easily just point it down at the ground, something like that, unlock from it, and that's a very easy way of positioning it. Of course, if you prefer, you could also select it and use brush rotation. Now, if that's selected, we actually need to do one last thing. Sunlight works off of a skybox type scenario, meaning that you would have one or more faces defined as a fake backdrop. So I'm going to go ahead and set that up. We're not actually going to add a skybox in yet. We're just going to set up the top surface as fake backdrop so that sunlight will work. And to test this out, I might have to adjust the rotation a little bit, but we can do a build all real quick and switch over into shaded mode. And there we've got much more detail.
It's a lot easier to see what's actually going on.
We could go into the sunlight and brighten it up just a little bit under light color, give it a light brightness of 128. And that way, I mean, except for the shadow, of course, since you notice the angle of the light that was set based off coming from this top surface. So we have a little bit of shadowing over here, but out in the light it gets easier to see because you have the light side and the shadowed side of the terrain itself. So with that, we'll jump back into terrain editing mode and continue on. So we have painting, and of course painting respects the various options, inner radius, outer radius. So if you wanted to not have any area affected 100%, you could simply drop that all the way down to 1, and it's a smoother effect now where you have the effect immediately starts to fade out from the beginning. And of course the strength to define how much you paint on per stroke. If you lower this way down, you would only paint a very little bit. Matter of fact, I'll move it a little up from that. So you can see it very slowly affects the terrain, and that's very nice for detail editing, where you want to be very careful about how the terrain is positioned. And while we're still painting, we can point out a few other things. Say you have a inner and outer radius combination you like, you can lock those together so that by simply adjusting the outer radius, both stay the same. So you have the same difference between the inner and outer radius. Out from that, we have the mirror. Now this is really handy if you want a symmetrical type terrain. You can drop this down and specify an axis, and then you actually have it'll mirror your location over to the other side. So if you were to paint, actually let me set the strength up a little bit more. It'll actually mirror, so you have the same thing on both sides of the terrain. You can mirror an X, Y, or both. So you can actually have four operations mirrored at the same time, which is really handy and really powerful for generating symmetric terrain. So with that, let me go ahead and turn mirroring back off, and that's basic painting. After that, we have smoothing. Now, what smoothing will do is to simply take all the values inside whatever radius you specified and average them out to basically smooth everything together. Done by holding Control, left dragging, and simply smooths out the terrain. And with this, we have a strength, so if we don't want to smooth very much, we can lower that down and the effect will occur more slowly. One thing to point out, though, is be careful when you're painting very near the edge. You notice how the brush starts to, once it hits the edge, you have a straight side of the brush. This can cause problems with smoothing. So I wouldn't recommend smoothing out to the very edge of the terrain. So after smoothing, we have noise, and this is simply to paint random values onto the height map to give a spiky sort of distorted effect or noise. So if I up the strength back up, it'll be easier to see. So you can paint noise over an area. And this is affected. Now this is affected by more than just strength. You saw strength, a higher strength meant that it would paint the noise more quickly, but we still seem to have a max amount that we can possibly raise the vertices affected by noise. What we can do is we can take the adjust, and that specifies the maximum amount we can move these vertices based on the noise itself. So if we up that to say 128, and then went to paint the noise, we could affect the vertices a lot more. Let me adjust that back down to 32. And noise is, it ends up working a lot better if you combine it with smoothing. You notice you have very jagged surfaces, so unless you had a very low adjust and only wanted a little bit of noise, this ends up looking quite jaggy and would be very hard to navigate. So we can combine that with a little bit of smoothing. Let me turn the strength way down so we can slowly affect this area. And you can see that's where having a very low amount of smoothing can help. So we take these jagged points and move them in. So let me run over that one last time without so much strong smoothing so fast. So we have very jaggy points. Switch over to smooth and do a very low smooth value, maybe even lower than that. And we can smooth those down. So you can combine smoothing with noise to it would give more pattern. If you had a rocky area, you could start out by adding noise and then smoothing it a little. So that's noise. After noise, we have flatten. Now, flatten is really interesting. The way this works is whatever point you have, wherever your brush is, before you start to flatten, acts as the master value for the flatten, if you will. So if I was to start over this area, hold Control and left drag, everything will be brought to that exact level immediately. So it immediately grabs that one value I was pointing and adds that to wherever I move the brush. So if you were to drag this over your entire terrain would become a flat plane at that point you selected. Now, as you can see, I could go and grab a different height, hit Control and start flattening again, and I'll start flattening to that level. Under flattening, we have visibility. Now, visibility is what you would use if you were to if you needed to cut out part of a level so you could build into it, like if you wanted to cut out the side of a hill. Let me lower the radius down again, and simply Control and right to erase faces out, or Control and left to paint them back in as visible. And it's simply a visible or not visible, 1 or 0 basically. So you have to actually use this, you have to, after you've cut out, you'll notice that the faces are kind of jaggy, and you'll have to go and add, you have to cover that up with brushes or static meshes. Let me go ahead and fill that back in. And finally, we have edge turn. Edge turn is more just for a final tweaking, and in order to see the effect, I'm actually going to switch the viewport over to wireframe. You notice how all the wireframe is running in a certain direction. What edge turn will allow us to do, and let me actually turn the radius back down to 1. This works best with 1 because it's generally used only for very fine tweaking once you're pretty much done with the terrain. You notice we have all the edges basically running in the same direction. If you control and right or left over that area, you see you can paint over individual faces and flip the edge. This can be useful if you have one sharp point, and it would and that part of the terrain would flow better if you had individual control over the edges, and that's what edge turn is for. Now, it will work with a radius greater than 1, but it's not really recommended because it will affect that entire radius and isn't the detailed control it's meant to be. So that's basically a run-through of all the tools you'll be using for basic terrain editing. Let me switch this back over into a shaded mode. The texture, pan, rotate, and scale are used with editing layers to modify the texture that belongs to that layer.
Very cool. So that's going to pretty much wrap up this lesson here where we're just taking a look at the basic tools.
Yep, that will.
Thanks a lot.